February 14th, 1945, 04:47 hours, Hürtgen Forest. Staff Sergeant Marcus Donovan could taste iron. People always said fear tasted like copper pennies. Tonight, with his face jammed into frozen mud and rotting leaves, he believed it. Every breath burned in his throat, turned to white vapor in front of his lips, and vanished into the darkness. 30 yards ahead, the German bunker complex lay invisible behind a black wall of fir trunks and earth. Only the MG-42's voice betrayed it, a ripping, canvas-tearing shriek that raked his squad's foxholes every time somebody so much as twitched. He tightened his numb fingers around the cold grip of his M3 submachine gun. The grease gun, the boys called it, because it looked like something you'd use under a truck, not take to kill a man. He knew its numbers by heart, 30 rounds in the magazine, about 450 per minute cyclic if you held the trigger, though the manuals liked to say 300 on controlled bursts. Tonight, there was nothing controlled about any of this. The Germans had an MG-42 up there, 1,200 rounds a minute if they wanted it, belts feeding from ammo cans, field of fire perfectly placed to rake the only approach. The math did not care who was from Pittsburgh and who was from the Ruhr. They'd been pinned for 40 minutes. Snow had packed into the folds of their sleeves and collars. 3 men who'd stuck their heads up at the wrong moment were lying where they'd fallen, half covered in powder, helmets at bad angles. "Covering fire!" Lieutenant Foster screamed somewhere to Marcus's right, voice already hoarse from yelling. "Jesus Christ, somebody give me some—" The MG-42 answered for them. A rolling burst chewed the top off the foxhole 2 spaces down. Dirt and splinters rained into Marcus's hole. A chunk of frozen root smacked his helmet. He flattened, pressing himself into the earth until he could feel the ice, too, through his ribs. 30 rounds. 4 more mags in his pouches. 150 .45 slugs against what sounded like an entire Wehrmacht platoon in concrete and logs. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement to his left. Private Williams slid down into his own scrape 20 feet away, panting steam. He lifted his grease gun just high enough for Marcus to see it. For a second, Donovan thought his eyes were lying. The magazine well didn't hold 1 stick of stamped steel. It held 3, welded together in a tight cluster, 2 down, 1 up, like some kind of grotesque metallic trident hanging off the bottom of the gun. 90 rounds sitting in the weapon before a reload. Williams caught his stare through the pre-dawn gloom and insanely grinned. Through the mask of frost and mud on his face, his lips formed 2 silent words. "Watch this." Another burst from the MG-42 screamed overhead, showering them both in snow and bark. Williams thumbed the safety forward and began to rise. Marcus's heart stopped. Before the Hurtgen trees tried to eat him, Marcus had lived under smokestacks. Pittsburgh had been steel and grime, furnaces and rivets. His old man had worked 30 years in a mill where the heat never really left your clothes. Marcus had grown up watching men coax miracles out of metal with hammers and welding torches, turning flat plate into bridges, ships, and factory roofs. When he'd first seen the M3 in an ordnance lecture stateside, he'd snorted under his breath. "It looks like a caulking gun," one of the other sergeants had said. "Grease gun," another had corrected. "Hell, it even uses a crank." The Thompson had been a proper gun, walnut and machined steel, heavy in the hands. The M3 was stamped sheet metal, ugly seams, sights that looked like afterthoughts. But it cost a fraction of the Thompson and didn't demand a machinist's full attention every time something bent. $20 a unit, the ordnance captain had said, almost proudly. "America fights with mass, gentlemen. We need something we can stamp out by the tens of thousands and throw in every truck." It still spat 45 ACP, though. At close range, the big slugs didn't care if they came out of a work of art or a glorified oil gun. The problem, Marcus had learned from Casino to the Hurtgen, wasn't lethality. It was time. 30-round magazines were fine in a house-to-house street fight, where your world existed in rooms and stairwells. In a forest of concrete bunkers and interlocking machine gun nests, they ran out too fast. Every drill at the range told you to fire in short bursts and change mags behind cover. Hurtgen's reality was that the cover ended at the lip of the hole, and the enemy had more barrels, more belts, more time. Williams, back in Belgium, had been the first one to say it out loud in the squad. "Why's it we always stop shooting first?" he'd muttered one night, hands cupped around a cigarette ember. "They just keep ripping and we're down there slapping in another magazine like idiots." "Because they got belts, and we don't, genius," someone had replied. "Yeah, but we got welders," Williams had said, "and D Company's motor pool's got a guy who swears he can stick 2 Jeep fenders together blind." Marcus had rolled his eyes, until a week later, when he'd walked past the maintenance tent and seen 3 M3 magazines clamped together in a vise, sparks bouncing off them. "Y'all are going to get somebody killed," he'd told the armorer. "Or we're going to let 'em shoot longer before they die," the man had shot back. "Depends whether you believe in math or miracles." Marcus came from a city that believed in both. He'd watched as Williams and the wrench-turners experimented. At first, they just taped magazines together side by side, jungle style, but the M3's feed lips were finicky. A bad angle meant double feeds and stoppages, the last thing you wanted when an MG-42 was chewing your tree line. So the armorer had gone further. Steam pipe, ground flat, welded along the spines of 3 mags. A simple, brutal coupler that kept them aligned perfectly, latched as one unit into the grease gun's mag well. 2 full mags hanging down, 1 feeding up. When you emptied the first, you punched the release, rotated the whole contraption over, and slammed the next stick into battery in one movement. Triple the ammo in the weapon before you ever reached for a pouch. Endless storm, Williams had called it, the first time they dumped 90 rounds in one sustained series of bursts into a dead hedgerow. The name stuck. Whether it would work when someone was aiming back, that was a question the Hürtgen foxhole was about to answer. The manuals didn't understand Hürtgen. They talked about forests, yes. They talked about suppressing strong points and bounding overwatch. But they did not talk about a place where every tree seemed to grow out of a concrete pillbox, where every cleared fire lane was booby-trapped, and where artillery turned the soil into a frozen meat grinder. On paper, a fire team with 1 SMG, a bar, and a handful of rifles could rush a machine gun nest with a supporting squad and maybe a tank. In reality, the trees and hidden bunkers ate tanks like kindling. For weeks, Marcus's regiment had been advancing yards at a time. Men who memorized their small unit tactics in Georgia were unlearning them in blood in Germany. You popped smoke. The wind turned and hugged it to the ground, or the trees shredded it before it ever screened you. You tried to work the flank. The flank revealed another MG-42 waiting at the perfect 90-degree angle to turn the attempt into a cull. Once they'd watched a company from another battalion try it by the book. Platoons moved out from a forest edge under carefully timed fire, only to be shredded when the Germans let them advance just far enough to be hemmed in by interlocking arcs. "What's the point of all this firepower if we can't reach the damn guns?" Lieutenant Foster had demanded one night, jabbing an unlit cigarette at the crude sketch Marcus had done of a bunker complex. "Point is, sir, they got longer teeth," Marcus had said quietly. "They put their MGs out past what we can give back with these." He'd tapped his grease gun. "And they know, if we call in the big stuff, it's as likely to land on us in these trees." Williams had been there, listening, twirling his triple-mag grease gun like a kid with a naughty toy. "Or," he'd said, "we bring more teeth to the front." Foster had given him a look halfway between exasperation and interest. "How's that circus? Rig treating you, Williams?" "Feed's fine so far, sir. Little heavy. But when they think we're out and they're still eating lead, I see a lot of crowd heads go down and stay down." A lieutenant couldn't officially endorse a field mod that made ordnance people grind their teeth. Unofficially, Foster had muttered, "Just make sure it doesn't jam when I'm standing next to you." The Hurtgen ledger kept adding names under "killed in action," either way. MG-42 belts and bursts were filling it faster than any other line. Somewhere in a warm office in the rear, Men with slide rules and flow charts were talking about tonnage and advance rates. Out here, in the frozen mud, Marcus and his squad were living each entry one scream at a time. If there was a way to turn 30 seconds of 45 into a full minute of sustained storm without coming out of the hole to fumble for another mag, maybe the ledger would be a little less cruel. That, maybe, was welded under Williams's hands right now. The first iteration of the triple mag had been ugly, even by grease gun standards. It had to be. M3 magazines were never as forgiving as Thompson sticks. Too much wobble, and you bought yourself a stovepipe or a bolt outrunning a limp spring. The armorer, who'd spent the first half of the war listening to tankers curse finicky 50s, wanted no part of that. Side by side is for boys with time, he'd said, knocking cheap tape jobs off the bench. You want to bring something into a forest where God and German machine guns both hate you? It's got to feed like it grew that way. So he'd clamped 3 mags back-to-back spine out, like organ pipes, and tack-welded a length of pipe along them, grinding off sharp edges. The result was a flat paddle of metal. With 3 protruding magazines, you could rotate through the magwell. The middle one sat in line with the feed lips. The other 2 hung on either side, ready to be swung up. You run the middle one dry, he'd explained to Williams and Marcus. Hit the mag release. Roll the whole damn cluster left or right until the next full mag clicks in. Slam with your palm. You don't fish in a pouch till you've burned all 3. What about springs? Marcus had asked. We're asking them to feed 30 in a cold gun in the middle of a forest. The armorer had grinned a little, proud. Pulled fresher springs from unishoed sticks. We're not idiots. Even so, he'd insisted on test after test. Short bursts, long bursts, mud baths, snowbanks. They'd dragged the thing through enough filth that most ordnance men would have labeled it condemned. It still ran. The talk in the company had tilted. What had been William's idiot contraption turned into that jungle-welded monster. When the triple mag gun laid down a hose of 45 that outlasted the MG-34 in a captured nest during one exercise, the platoon started joking that someone must have smuggled a coal, Browning inside it. Rumor, as always, moved faster than clarification. Somewhere one of Foster's peers half-instructed, half-warned of grease guns with drums to his own platoon. Another insisted he'd seen a man empty 100 rounds without reloading, conveniently forgetting the pause where a practiced hand rolled the mag cluster. On the other side of the line, fragments filtered through German ears. A captured patrol whispered about Americans with weird little guns that never stopped. In one squad, a veteran leaned in and said, half disbelieving, "Endlos Sturm, endless storm. I heard it from a friend in the 89th. They thought the Yank was empty, then he just kept firing." By February, the name Endless Storm was being thrown around both sides of the trees, one jokingly, one not. Regimental HQ, naturally, stayed officially oblivious. There were no paperwork changes. No requisition forms for M3 triple mag mod, field expedient. Ordnance bulletins were still more concerned with frozen lubricants and bent cocking cranks. In the frozen foxholes around a nameless bunker complex, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether 3 magazines welded together would feed when a man's hands were shaking too badly to eat. Inside the German bunker, the MG-42 team was bored. Cold, yes. Numb, yes. Eyes stinging from cordite and smoke sneaking back through the slit, yes. But bored. They hadn't had a real infantry rush at their position in days. Mostly, it had been patrols. A squad here, a platoon there, probing like blind fingers in the dark. Easy meat for a gun, sighted the way Feldwebel Otto Keller's was. He caressed the grips, felt the steel under his gloves, listened to the assistant gunner feed the belt. The legs of the Lafette mount bit firmly into the packed earth. The beaten zone just beyond the line of scraggly spruce was as familiar to him now as his mother's kitchen. "Links, rechts," he murmured, sweeping a short test burst across the empty snow, more to feel the weapon's mood than anything. The 42 responded with its usual demonic chatter, casings spilling onto the sheet iron nailed to the floor to keep them from burying themselves. "Save it," the lieutenant grumbled from the rear of the bunker. "You know they'll try again before dawn. They always do." Otto suppressed a grin. Let them. He had belts. He had sighted fire lanes. He had crates of spare barrels. They had faith, perhaps, and little dirty submachine guns that spat pistol rounds. His assistant, a skinny Saxon kid everyone called Hürtgen, even though he was 21, shrugged inside his coat. "They call those things trench brooms," Hürtgen said. "Our prisoners talk. Thompsons, M3, whatever. Good for rats that get inside the walls, I suppose." "Good," Otto said. "Let them bring brooms. We have a scythe." They heard the Americans before they saw them. A clink of gear, a muffled curse in English, the accidental crunch of frost-stiffened brush. Otto's lips thinned. He loved and hated their clumsiness. Loved it because it made his job easier. Hated it because it meant they hadn't yet learned not to come. "Bereit," he said soft. Chapters, the first flares had not yet gone up. This was sound and instinct. When he saw the faint suggestion of movement at the edge of his lane, he squeezed. The gun barked its ripping cloth song. Snow and splinters flew where the rounds chewed into the top of a shallow foxhole. Someone screamed. Someone else went abruptly quiet. They returned fire, of course, a stuttering hollow series of cracks and barks. Otto smirked. Pistol caliber. No bite at this distance. One man popped up a second too long. Otto stroked the trigger and cut him down. This was the math Zimmerman and his maps relied on. Bunkers and MGs as multipliers. You didn't need a tank if you turned every approach into an abattoir. Then, after maybe half an hour of this, something changed. The incoming fire from the Americans, which had been sporadic, faltered, then surged back with a different rhythm. Otto frowned. The sound was still the flat thump of 45, but longer, less of the up-down stutter and more of a steady hose. One burst went on far longer than it should have. "They must be changing men on the gun," Hürtgen muttered. "In a foxhole that small?" Otto said. "Idiot." He swung the 42 toward the source of that audacity, started to squeeze, and a moment later, the earth under the bunker's lip jumped in a hard, localized concussion. Not artillery, not mortar. Too close, too sharp. "Granite!" someone shouted. A second later, another blast tore into the flank of their firing slit. Dirt and splinters flew inward. Otto ducked, shielded his eyes. Hürtgen yelped as a shard scored his cheek. The third blast collapsed part of the parapet altogether. Coughed from... where? The Americans were still hugging their ditch. Otto hadn't heard the characteristic whump and delayed arc of a rifle grenade. The explosions seemed to come too fast, too flat. He hissed orders, shifted belts, tried to reacquire the lane. A fourth concussion slammed them against the back wall and blew the MG off its mount. As he scrambled to his knees, ears ringing, trying to wrestle the weapon bang. Look upright, he heard a phrase from one of the younger men in the support trench outside. Half shout, half panicked prayer. "Endloser Sturm, Herr Feldwebel! Endless storm! Their little guns! They don't stop!" Bullets and detonations rolled together into one indistinguishable roar. For the first time in months behind that gun, Otto Keller felt the cold press somewhere other than his fingers. The sky, it seemed, was not the only place the enemy had been improving. From where Marcus lay, the first thing Williams's "watch this" did was get him killed. That was the thought that slammed into Marcus's chest when the kid surged up out of his foxhole, triple-mag grease gun at his hip, and hosed a long, defiant burst toward the muzzle flashes. "Williams, you stupid son of a—" Marcus started. The MG-42 opened up reflexively, drawn like a wasp to movement. Snow exploded around Williams in a white halo. For a heartbeat, Marcus could see the private outlined against the world, slightly taller because he refused to duck. Then Williams dropped back, a curse ripping from his lungs, not a death rattle. He landed in his hole panting, eyes wild. "Jam?" Marcus yelled. "Hell no!" Williams shouted back, breathing hard. "Just letting 'em know we're not empty." He slapped the side of the welded mags with an open palm. "Middle stick's dry," he called. "Rolling to the next." He thumbed the mag release, twisted his wrist, and the entire paddle of 3 magazines rotated in his hand like tuning a radio. When one of the full sticks clicked into line with the magwell, he drove it home with the heel of his palm. "Still having fun, Krauts!" he roared, and popped up for another burst. This time, Marcus saw something different in the German response. The 42 still fired, but the initial confident arcs went high and wild. Someone up there was not pleased that their expected comforting pause in American fire never materialized. "Donovan!" Lieutenant Foster barked, voice shredding in the cold air. "You see what that damn thing's doing? We're not wasting this!" Marcus forced his body to move. He rolled onto one knee, staying low, peering over the torn lip of his foxhole. The MG position was still just a smear of darkness and muzzle flash. But in the few seconds William's storm had bought them, he could see the peripheral rifle pits more clearly as they shifted. Easy. "On my mark," Foster rasped. "Williams and Donovan lay it on their main gun. Everyone else pick a pit and make it hurt. Then we move." "Move where, sir?" someone croaked. "Forward," Foster said. "While they're still convinced, we should be dead." The next 10 seconds were a blur. Marcus knew he'd never fully reconstruct. On mark, he and Williams surged as one, raising their grease guns just high enough to clear the rim, fingers locking down on the triggers. The twin streams of .45 stitched the brush around the MG-42's slit, chewing into logs, dirt, and any unlucky flesh behind. The triple mag turned what would have been a desperate 3-second magazine dump into a sustained hammering roar. Even when Marcus knew his own 30 were gone, Williams' fire kept going, the pitch of the gun steady. He saw an indistinct shape tumble out from behind the parapet up there. Another followed. The 42 hiccuped, then spat a ragged half-burst into nowhere as someone dragged it back. "Go!" Foster bellowed. They went. Out of the relative safety of their holes, across 10 yards of open, churned, snow-crusted earth that felt like a mile. Men he'd sweated with in Georgia and bled with in Italy were suddenly figures in his peripheral vision, dark blurs rising and falling. Marcus fired on the move, grease gun bucking in his hands, feeling for the dead sensation of an empty mag. When it came, he hit the release and slammed in a fresh stick from his pouch with numb fingers, cursing every second the muzzle wasn't talking. Ahead, Williams dropped to a knee, rotated his mag cluster a second time, and brought the gun up again without ever going back to his belt. "You're empty," Marcus barked. "Not yet," Williams snapped, eyes blazing. They hit the German line harder than any of them would have dared an hour earlier. Grenades arced in. The bar on the flank, which had been silent out of respect for the 42's authority, roared to life, its .30-06 rounds slamming into anyone who showed a silhouette. The bunkers weren't invincible. They were just well-positioned boxes of men, boxes that could not function at full capacity when men inside had their heads down and guns jammed with dirt and fear. Marcus vaulted the last fallen tree, slammed shoulder first into the side of a firing position, and thrust his grease gun over the lip, squeezing out the last of his mag into shadow and screams. When the shooting finally tapered off, his lungs felt like they'd been lined with razor blade. Des. His hands shook so badly he barely trusted them to safe the weapon. Around him, in the wreckage of the bunker complex, the forest smoked and steamed. Some of his squad were on their feet. Some weren't. William slumped against a tree, triple mag grease gun across his knees, chest heaving, steam pouring off him in the cold air. "Endless enough for you, Sarge?" he croaked. Marcus opened his mouth to answer and realized he was laughing. A hysterical, exhausted sound, but laughter all the same. In the ruin of the German positions, one of the surviving enemy infantry, hands in the air, eyes wide, kept glancing at the welded magazines with something like superstition. "Endlos Sturm," he murmured in disbelief. Endless storm. The name, Marcus figured, was going to stick. They didn't write it into any manual. No ordnance board convened after Bougainville, Anzio, or Hurtgen to stamp approved triple mag modification M3 submachine gun. It stayed what it had been born as, a field hack, a welder's answer to a gunner's prayer. After that fight, A few more armorers in the regiment quietly welded their own paddles. A sergeant in another battalion tried it on an MP40 and nearly broke his wrist when the thing overbalanced. Some experiments lived, some died. The war was full of them, little stitches in the fabric of doctrine that never made it back to the loom. What did make it back were stories. German after-action reports from that sector mentioned Feuerstöße aus kleinen Waffen, die nicht endeten, burst from small weapons that did not end when they should have. One jittery prisoner of war babbled about Handmaschinengewehre with Dreifach magazine that turned a patrol's advance into a meat saw. On the American side, replacement officers hearing about it months later dismissed it as exaggeration. Grease guns with drums joined the list of frontline myths, somewhere between tigers under every bush and paratroopers who could smell ambushes. But in smoky bars and VFW halls, it became one of those tales men told not to impress civilians, but to remind each other of the thin, stupid margins between alive and not. Years later, when someone in procurement finally put under-barrel grenade launchers under rifles, or when the armory issued double-drum mags for some new 5.56 wonder, there was always an old NCO somewhere who'd look at the shiny, factory-perfect contraption and mutter, "Hell, we were doing that in the trees with a grease gun and a plumber's pipe." In Pittsburgh, when the mills had started to close and the city's smoke thinned, Marcus sometimes walked past a scrapyard and saw triplets of metal leaning against a fence, pipe, bar, and barna, and felt an old weight in his hands. He'd tell the story occasionally, if someone bought him enough beer and didn't lead with questions about metals. About the night he watched a kid from Iowa or Jersey or God knew where roll 3 magazines together and stand up into the teeth of a German machine gun because he believed, for just long enough, that more bullets might equal more life. "When you're in a hole and the world wants you gone," he'd say, "you don't give a damn if the idea is authorized. You care if it feeds and fires." On a rusting shelf, in an armory somewhere, maybe turned in, maybe lost under a pile of condemned parts, a battered M3 might still exist, with an ugly welded paddle of 3 scars along its magazines, tape residue flaking at the edges. No one would tag it for a museum. No one would write it up in an official development history. But for one pre-dawn in the Hurtgen, in a frozen foxhole 30 yards from a bunker complex someone had decided was untakeable, it had earned a name from the enemy and bought men just enough time to live. Sometimes, endless storm didn't mean the number of rounds in the gun. It meant the number of times men like Marcus and Williams refused to accept the math the battlefield handed them and found some ugly welded way to change the equation.